Welcome to our channel. Today we're sharing the incredible and inspiring story of Sergeant Alvin C. York, a true American hero of World War I. From his humble beginnings in rural Tennessee to his legendary bravery on the battlefield, York's journey is one of courage, sacrifice, and determination. Yet, his post-war life was marked by struggles and challenges that highlight the complexities of being a national hero. Join us as we explore the life, triumphs, and trials of Sergeant Alvin C. York, a man whose legacy continues to inspire generations. He came from humble beginnings in a remote corner of Tennessee where life was harder than most of us today can imagine. His childhood was spent in a sparsely populated region of the Cumberland Mountains, in Fentress County's Wolf River Valley. Back in the late 19th century, that place was defined by poor soil, small farms, and homespun traditions that had been passed down through generations of self-reliant mountain people. They hunted for food rather than sport. They farmed rocky land just to get by, and every penny counted when you were trying to feed a big family. Alvin's father, William York, worked as a blacksmith, while his mother, Mary York, labored at home and in the fields. They had 11 children in total. Alvin was born on December the 13th, 1887, and he grew up in a 2-room log cabin that had none of the modern amenities we'd consider basic today. Alvin showed a keen eye for marksmanship early on. He learned to hunt wild turkeys, which were abundant in the area. In those days, if you couldn't bring down your game quickly, you might miss out on a crucial meal. Turkeys especially are skittish, fast, and have sharp senses. One of the ways to bring them down without scaring off the flock was to aim straight for the head. So Alvin got exceptionally good at precise shooting. It's said he could hit a turkey's head so cleanly that the bird would drop without much commotion, letting him bag multiple birds if he was lucky. As a kid, he entered local shooting contests and turkey shoots. These events weren't just for bragging rights, but also a way to make a little extra money or to stock the family larder. They were big social gatherings in those hills, giving people an outlet in a region that had few recreational opportunities. That skill at hitting tiny targets from a long distance would come to define Alvin later in life, though nobody could have guessed at the time just how significant his sharpshooting talents would become. Because he was a vital hand at home helping feed his family and keep the farm going, Alvin barely got any formal schooling. In all, he spent only about 9 months in a classroom, and that happened off and on, so he never advanced beyond the 3rd grade. Education was a luxury in the Cumberland Mountains. Survival came first. As he got older, he would look back with a twinge of regret about his limited education. He saw how a lack of schooling closed off opportunities for mountain folks, and it bothered him that many young people couldn't read or write well. Determined to change things for the generations that came after him, Alvin would eventually become a champion for education in his region, dedicating himself to building a school that offered local children a chance to learn the basics he had missed. Everything changed in 1911 when Alvin's father died. With William York gone, Alvin had to shoulder the role of family breadwinner. He labored on railroad crews, worked on highway construction teams, and did whatever odd jobs came his way, whether that was cutting timber or busting rocks. Life was hand-to-mouth, and that sort of existence can wear a person down. Many people in those days escaped that grind through heavy drinking and rowdy, boisterous nightlife, at least what passed for nightlife in rural Tennessee. Alvin was no saint in his younger days. After grueling hours in the hot sun, with little to look forward to, he turned to saloons and rough bars that offered cheap whiskey, cards, and the occasional brawl. He gambled, he drank, and he fought, sometimes with fists, sometimes with broken bottles or whatever else was on hand. More than once he woke up with a nasty bruise or a black eye, not always sure exactly how he'd gotten them. In a rugged environment where law enforcement was scarce, these scuffles weren't unusual, though they could escalate dangerously. Alvin went down that road for a while, seemingly on a collision course with jail or an early grave, until he started paying attention to the local church. A neighbor named Gracie Williams played a big part in that transformation. She was a devout member of the Church of Christ in Christian Union, a small sect that had very strict rules against violence, alcohol, and all sorts of worldly entertainments. Gracie saw something in Alvin that he might not have seen in himself at that point. Whether it was love, concern, or pure faith, she nudged him toward attending services with her. Alvin might have shrugged it off at first, but the more he went, the more he found himself moved by what he heard in sermons and what he felt stirring inside him. Around 1914, he underwent a spiritual conversion he always described as a direct communication with God. He ditched the saloons, the gambling, and the brawling almost overnight, and he immersed himself in that church community. By 1917, he'd become the second elder of the church, a post that reflected his newfound commitment and leadership within the congregation. Right around that time, though, the United States was getting dragged into World War I. Europe had been in turmoil since 1914, sparked by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary, which set off a chain reaction of alliances and battles across the continent. The U.S. had been hesitant to join, but German U-boat attacks on American ships and other provocations finally pushed President Woodrow Wilson to ask Congress for a declaration of war. American men were being drafted in large numbers to fill the ranks of the American Expeditionary Forces, which would be sent over there, as the popular song of the time put it. Despite his devout faith and strong aversion to killing, Alvin York was drafted in 1917. This was a wrenching dilemma for him. His church was firmly against violence, and he genuinely believed that killing was a sin. Yet the draft board turned down his conscientious objector application because the Church of Christ in Christian Union wasn't recognized as a mainstream nationally established denomination. He was left with no choice but to serve. Alvin training at Camp Gordon in Georgia, where he made an immediate impression on his superiors. While he hesitated to shoot at silhouette targets shaped like human torsos, when he did fire, his skill was so extraordinary that they couldn't ignore it. He could hit the bullseye from a distance of 200, 300, even 500 yards, a feat that few could match. He ended up in Company G of the 328th Infantry Regiment, which was part of the 82nd Division. The 82nd would soon be known as the All-American Division, filled with men from all corners of the country. Eventually, that unit shipped out to France in 1918. Alvin's spirit was torn. On one hand, he couldn't shake his moral qualms about taking another human life. On the other, he felt that disobeying orders or refusing to fight might be a betrayal of his duty and his fellow soldiers. When he landed in France, he saw firsthand the devastation that war had unleashed across the countryside. Towns were rubble, fields were cratered, and roads were clogged with refugees. The conditions in the trenches were appalling, with mud, rats, disease, and constant shell fire. Alvin's superiors, Captain Edward Danforth and Major George Edward Buxton, sometimes spelled Buckton in various accounts, tried to explain to him that this war was, in their eyes, a righteous cause. The Germans had invaded France and Belgium, inflicting terrible suffering. President Wilson had often described the American role as fighting to make the world safe for democracy. Alvin prayed for guidance. He was taught that the Holy Scriptures allowed for the defense of innocent lives, so eventually he accepted that he would do his part as a soldier. The Meuse-Argonne offensive began on September the 26th, 1918, as the last major Allied push to break the German lines and force an armistice. It was one of the deadliest campaigns in American history, with more than 1 million U.S. troops involved. On October 8, 1918, Alvin and about 16 men from his platoon were ordered to flank a German machine gun position in the Argonne Forest. The plan was to come around from behind and take out the German nest, which was spraying bullets across the battlefield and pinning down American forces. As the small group crept through the thick underbrush, they managed to surprise a cluster of German soldiers. But before they could secure them, another German unit spotted them and opened fire with multiple machine guns. In an instant, 9 Americans went down, either dead or severely wounded. Suddenly, Alvin found himself as one of the few able-bodied men left. He started picking off the machine gunners with uncanny accuracy. He aimed for their heads, just like those turkeys he used to bring down back in the Wolf River Valley, because he knew a single clean shot would drop them and prevent them from returning fire. Realizing one man was wreaking havoc on their line, the Germans sent a bayonet charge of 5 or 6 soldiers to silence him. But Alvin was calm under pressure in a way that few are. He later explained how he targeted the ones in the back first so that the front ranks didn't realize they were being picked off. That was exactly how he'd keep a flock of turkeys from scattering, and it worked just as well in the chaos of war. Each shot landed true. By the end, he'd neutralized the threat around him. The German officer in charge of the machine gun nest was so stunned by this display of marksmanship and determination that he offered to surrender. Alvin, along with the remaining few men in his platoon, ended up capturing 132 German prisoners in total, a staggering number, given their precarious situation. After marching those prisoners back to American lines, Alvin was hailed as a hero. Word of his feat spread through letters, official reports, and eventually newspapers back home. Alvin didn't like the attention. He was deeply conflicted about having taken so many lives, but the U.S. military saw it as an extraordinary act of bravery that exemplified the best of the American spirit. Alvin was awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration in the United States, as well as the French Croix de Guerre and other honors from Allied nations. But for Alvin, it wasn't a moment of personal pride. It was something he accepted had to be done, but he never glorified it. In his mind, his faith and conscience were still wrestling over those shots fired in the Argonne. The war ended on November 11, 1918, when the armistice went into effect. Alvin York returned home in May 1919 to a hero's welcome. Parades, interviews, and accolades followed him everywhere. Yet he just wanted to get back to the Wolf River Valley and marry Gracie Williams, the woman whose quiet faith had first set him on a different path. They wed on June 7, 1919, and settled into life on a farm that local citizens had helped buy for him as a gesture of gratitude. Despite this, he refused to let fame go to his head. He often said he had done nothing more than his duty and that many other soldiers deserved equal credit. But the press adored the story of a simple mountain man whose deadly accuracy and steadfast courage had made him a battlefield legend. By 1926, Alvin had established the Alvin C. York Agricultural Institute, commonly known as the Alvin C. York Institute. He traveled across the country, gave speeches, and raised money from anyone who would listen to his war stories. It wasn't easy, and he sometimes clashed with local politicians over funding and curriculum, but he refused to give up. His sincerity and the aura of his war record opened doors that might otherwise have been closed. Many philanthropic groups, churches, and private donors chipped in. Over time, the school grew and became a beacon of learning in a place that desperately needed it. Despite his condemnation of violence, Alvin wasn't naive about the realities of global conflict. In the late 1930s, as World War II loomed, he felt a moral obligation to speak up in favor of American preparedness. He believed that the rise of aggressive regimes like Nazi Germany threatened not just Europe, but the entire world. So in 1941, when Hollywood came knocking, Alvin reluctantly allowed a movie to be made about his life. He was initially against the idea, not least because his church frowned on movie theaters and films in general, considering them worldly distractions. But he saw a chance to use the film's publicity to strengthen national defense and possibly raise money for his educational ventures. And so Sergeant York, starring Gary Cooper and directed by Howard Hawks, hit the screens. It was an enormous box office success and received multiple Oscar nominations. Cooper himself won the Academy Awards for Best Actor for his portrayal of Alvin. The movie brought Alvin right back into the spotlight at a time when America needed national heroes to rally the public as it faced the prospect of entering another global war. Financially, however, Alvin struggled. He was generous to a fault, frequently giving away or investing in ill-advised ventures. He also had a large family to support. He and Gracie would eventually have 10 children. The complexities of managing land, a school, a large household, and charitable donations proved overwhelming. Though the film and speaking engagements did bring in money, Alvin simply wasn't equipped to handle the accounting or the sharks that sometimes swam around a famous war hero looking to profit. He entrusted various people with his finances, some of whom did not manage his affairs ethically, and he found himself in mounting debt. Worse, his health began to deteriorate in the 1950s. In 1954, Alvin suffered a stroke that left him partially paralyzed. He couldn't speak or travel for lectures anymore, and his medical bills piled up, intensifying his financial problems. People across Tennessee and indeed across the country recognized that Alvin York had given more than most would ever be asked to give. Donations, benefits, and assistance from veterans groups helped keep him and his family afloat. Over time, his children took on more responsibilities. Alvin lived out his final years quietly, still deeply devoted to his faith and family. On September 2nd, 1964, at the age of 76, he passed away from another stroke in the Veterans Hospital in Nashville. It was the end of an extraordinary life that had veered from the backwoods of Tennessee to the bloody trenches of France and then back again. He was laid to rest in the Wolf River Cemetery, near where he was born, ensuring that in the end, he returned to the mountains he had never really left in spirit. The legacy of Sergeant Alvin York is complex. On one hand, he's remembered as one of America's greatest war heroes, a man whose actions on that single day in October 1918 captured the imagination of a nation. On the other hand, he's also remembered for his personal struggle with the morality of violence, his religious convictions, and his lifelong efforts to uplift the poor mountain children of Tennessee. The Alvin C. York Institute still stands as a testament to his commitment to education. Today, visitors to Pall Mall, Tennessee can tour the Sergeant Alvin C. York State Historic Park, which includes his farm and the modest home where he and Gracie lived. Statues of him appear in Tennessee and on the grounds of the state capitol, a lasting reminder of a man whose humility remained intact even when he was hailed as a national icon. But there's another layer to Alvin York's life that many find deeply moving: his post-war disillusionment. It's not that he thought his service had been meaningless. Rather, he was haunted by the realization that war, no matter how just it might be, leaves scars that don't fade easily. Like countless other veterans of the First World War, he came home with what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress. The horrors of machine gun fire, artillery barrages, and watching friends die around him were not memories he could simply file away and forget. He spoke often about the need for peace and the responsibility nations have to seek diplomacy over conflict whenever possible. He wasn't a pacifist in the strictest sense. He believed in defending the innocent, but he understood that the cost of war is always tragically high. This perspective made him a particularly powerful voice in the interwar period and even during World War II, when he supported the American war effort but cautioned that the aftermath of victory should focus on rebuilding and preventing future conflicts. In reflecting on Alvin's struggle to readjust, we see the widespread challenges that returning veterans faced. He wasn't the only doughboy to have difficulty managing finances, relationships, or a sense of purpose after 1918. The Great War was a conflict of a scope the world hadn't experienced before. Millions dead, entire cities and villages obliterated, an entire generation scarred. The fighting ended abruptly, and many survivors found themselves with physical injuries, shell shock, what we'd now label PTSD, and a public that both lionized them and failed to fully grasp the depth of their trauma. Alvin's drinking problem in the post-war years, his sense of isolation, and his near obsession with helping others can be partly understood as symptoms of that bigger picture. War changes people, and coming back to a normal life can be a rocky path. For Alvin, his faith was a central stabilizing force through all this turmoil. Even though his church had strict rules that sometimes clashed with the messy reality of modern life, it gave him a moral compass. He would pray for guidance in making decisions, whether they were about finances, raising funds for his school, or supporting America's entry into World War II. His identity was shaped as much by his role as a devout Christian as by his role as a war hero, and he tried to reconcile those two identities in a way that made sense for him. Sometimes that balancing act put him at odds with other members of his church, especially about the film Sergeant York, but Alvin believed that telling his story served a higher purpose. He hoped it might steer the nation toward a proper sense of duty and away from isolationism at a time when fascism threatened the globe. Gary Cooper's portrayal of Alvin in the 1941 film was widely praised for capturing the hero's modest demeanor. Cooper spent time with Alvin, visiting the farm in Tennessee to observe his mannerisms and speech patterns. Although Hollywood inevitably took some liberties in dramatizing events, Alvin was generally pleased with the film's overall spirit. It highlighted his wrestling with faith and duty, showing him in the saloon fights of his youth, then in the calm of his conversion, and finally on the battlefield, torn between his conscience and his duty to his men. The film's success further complicated Alvin's finances because suddenly there were merchandise deals, publicity requests, and potential endorsements. He tried to steer any profits toward the school, but legal entanglements and managerial confusion drained much of the revenue. In later years, he admitted he'd grown exhausted by the constant demands on his time and the swirl of money issues that came with fame. Those around him would recall how Alvin never lost his sense of community. Despite his disabilities later in life, he'd still try to attend church functions and school events whenever possible. He held fast to the idea that no amount of fame or money replaced the fulfillment of doing something good for one's neighbors. In interviews, he would still talk as if he were just a simple farm boy from the Tennessee hills. He'd speak in a soft drawl about how, if folks just helped each other and stuck to their principles, the world would be a better place. That folksiness wasn't an act, it was just who he was. And that authenticity was part of why he was beloved. The way he carried himself told people that being famous didn't change his core values. At times, though, The simple country boy image overshadowed the more complex, reflective side of Alvin York. He read the Bible diligently, made notes in the margins, and devoured any religious tracts or newspapers he could get his hands on. He might have only had a third-grade formal education, but he was no intellectual lightweight. He'd debate theology and ethics with pastors and traveling evangelists, often impressing them with his grasp of Scripture and moral philosophy. He wanted to ensure that his stance on war, peace, and personal conduct aligned not just with the written word, but also with the spirit of the faith he professed. The question of why a man of God would become a soldier was one he wrestled with for the rest of his days, and in that wrestling, he found a way to be both, a soldier when duty called and a man of peace whenever possible. The respect Alvin earned cut across typical social boundaries of the time. Veterans, churchgoers, civic organizations, even Hollywood actors, and political leaders praised him. During World War II, he sometimes appeared at war bond rallies, lending his name and story to encourage Americans to contribute financially to the war effort. Despite being an advocate for peace, he believed that once aggression was unleashed in places like Poland and France, standing aside would only embolden dictators. But he repeatedly reminded anyone who'd listen that winning a war was just the start. The real challenge was ensuring that victory led to a stable and just peace, so that children wouldn't grow up to face another global conflict as devastating as the one he'd fought in. Over the decades, historians have taken a close look at Alvin's life and the details of his wartime service. There have been debates about the exact number of Germans he captured, or which members of his squad survived or took part in the fighting. Some accounts credit Alvin alone for feats that may have involved others, while official military records back up the majority of the standard story. That he led a small group, eliminated multiple machine guns, and captured a large number of prisoners. In truth, Alvin himself never seemed comfortable with being singled out as the one-man army the newspapers loved to describe. He always said it was a team effort, that he was just trying to keep his men alive, and that God had guided his bullets. That humility might be part of why his legend endured. When we fast forward to the latter part of his life, we see a man battered by health issues and frustrated by financial woes, but still steadfast in his moral convictions. Confined mostly to his home after his stroke in 1954, Alvin relied on Gracie and the kids for care. Sometimes well-wishers from far away would send him letters or small donations, recalling the day they met him at a war bonds rally, or how their father once fought alongside him. He cherished that recognition not for the ego boost, but because it reminded him that he hadn't been forgotten. He worried about drifting into poverty and irrelevance, as so many aging veterans do. Yet in his final days, he seemed at peace with his life's work. He had done his best to provide education for mountain children, to speak up for peace and national defense when he believed it necessary, and to be a decent husband, father, and neighbor. When he died at the Veterans Hospital in Nashville on that September day in 1964, the nation mourned the loss of a quintessential American hero. Newspapers ran obituaries lauding his extraordinary deeds in the Argonne, his charitable works, and the sincerity of his faith. Military officials, local dignitaries, and ordinary citizens attended his funeral in the Cumberland Mountains. The final farewell took place at the modest cemetery near Wolf River, where one could hear the breeze rustling through the trees, the same hillsides where Alvin had grown up hunting turkeys. The ceremony was simple and dignified, reflecting the man himself. Today you can still visit his grave, marked by a headstone that references his military honors and quotes scripture. People come to pay respect, sometimes leaving small mementos, sometimes just standing silently to contemplate the journey that took a poor farm boy from near anonymity to international fame, and finally to a lasting place in the annals of American history. Sergeant Alvin C. York's life was a testament to the strength of character, faith, and resilience. From his heroic actions during World War I to his dedication to education in his community, York's story is one of profound impact and enduring inspiration. Though his life ended with challenges, his legacy as a soldier, a leader, and a man of faith lives on. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories of extraordinary figures from history. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.